كله كلام في كلام في كلام، كله كلام في كلام في كلام، أعذارك كلها أوهام. كله كلام في كلام في كلام، كله كلام في كلام في كلام، أعذارك كلها أوهام. سيبني وابعد عني، ارحمني خلينا انام. سيبني وابعد عني، ارحمني خلينا انام. من غيرك انا كنت في حالي، اتهنى واعيش بسلام. يا سلام ده كلام. لا انا عايزه منك كلمه ولا شعر وغرام.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third day of this year's annual Popcorn Forum and the city of Alexandria, the last great city of the ancient world that we will be visiting during our journey through time and space, actually, as we move from city to city. Tomorrow we'll make a big jump in time to Paris. But today we are in Alexandria, and the first event will be the keynote address. By the way, my name is Tom Flint from the NIC Philosophy Department, and I will be your host and moderator for the day. And our first event will be the keynote address for this year's 28th Annual Popcorn Forum with a journey through time and space with the great cities and so forth. Following the keynote address will be another presentation from someone who represents the great intellectual tradition of Judaism, which thrived in the city of Alexandria, along with the several other traditions of the ancient world. But first, our keynote address for the week will be presented by Dr. Clay Jenkinson, who we remember well from his visit here last year. And Dr. Jenkinson is a professor of humanities and currently on leave from the University of Nevada, Reno. He was trained in Greek and Latin at the University of Minnesota and was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University in England, where he did a special study of the Homeric epic and also received a degree in Renaissance English literature and theology. Dr. Jenkinson is one of the founders and nation's leading authority on the modern Chautauqua movement. He has now portrayed Thomas Jefferson in this venue over 1,000 times, and he also gives seminars on classical literature twice yearly in Des Moines, Iowa. And today we are proud to present to you Dr. Jenkinson, who will give the keynote address for the 28th Annual Popcorn Forum. The title of his address is The Legacy of the Ancient World, The Rise of Law. Everyone, please welcome Dr. Clay Jenkinson.
Good morning, everyone, and Let me thank you for inviting me here again. I look forward each year to the Popcorn Forum at North Idaho College in Coeur d'Alene as one of the highlights of my year. And it's often said that an institution is the lengthened shadow of one man. If ever that were true, the Popcorn Forum is the legacy, the living legacy of Tony Stewart. I think it's extraordinary when one person's energy and inspiration and creativity can galvanize a community. He, of course, doesn't do it alone, but it probably wouldn't happen without him. And I'm grateful that he includes me in this program. My role this morning is a difficult one. I need to first follow a belly dancer, and second, summarize ancient civilization in 45 minutes and take some questions too. So I'm not sure that I can do this, but I want to talk a little bit about the legacy of Greece, what we owe to the Greek world. I'm really thinking more of mainland Greece than Alexandria, although Alexandria was a late flowering of Hellenism. And I also want to, I hope, inspire you to read in the classical literature. I'm going to recommend books. I'm an optimist about books. I'm going to recommend 4 books really highly this morning. In fact, as I was sitting backstage, I rank them according to their level of difficulty, so you can decide in advance whether you want to make the commitment. I very strongly recommend that you all read the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer. These are the most ancient texts in Western civilization, certainly the most ancient in Greek civilization. They exist in a range of translations, including a very good recent translation by Robert Fagles. I would give them level of difficulty 3 out of 10, so they're actually quite easy to read. I'm also recommending Virgil's Aeneid, which is the Roman epic based upon, in some regards, based upon Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. At one point, the Aeneid was the most important piece of literature in the world. As recently as 100 years ago, no civilized, no well-educated person could not know the Aeneid. Well, today, of course, that sounds like a ludicrous statement. But 100 years ago, if you wanted to call yourself educated in any significant sense, you knew Virgil's Aeneid, and you probably knew parts of it in Latin. So you see what's happening to culture. It's widening enormously in our time, but it's a little less deep than it was at one point earlier in the history of Western education. But it's a great book, and I highly recommend it. I'd give it a level of difficulty 6, so it's not as easy to read as Homer. And then finally, I recommend the Oresteia. If you were here yesterday, you got a taste of Sophocles and Antigone. Today I would recommend Aeschylus, the first Greek dramatic writer whose works we have. And he wrote a trilogy. This is the way tragedies tended to be structured in the ancient world. He wrote a trilogy called the Oresteia, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about it this morning. It's really about the rise of law in ancient Greece. It's a magnificent work, not very hard. I'd give it a level of difficulty 4. And I'll mention these again. And finally, I'm going to make a very bizarre and hopeless pitch. I'm going to suggest that all of you learn ancient Greek. Now, I know this sounds comic, but Greek is a magnificent language, and it's available to you now thanks to computers and the internet and satellites and fine teaching tools. I can't imagine anything that would be a more wonderful commitment for you to make than to try to learn ancient Greek. I'd give this a level of difficulty 8, so it's not something you can do on the side. But people who have attempted it, including people in their 80s, find their lives in a kind of renaissance from it. Anyway, enough of that. Let me start by talking a little bit about the general legacy of Greece. The presence of a belly dancer reminded me of a very important theme, and that is that Western civilization, our civilization, has been a mix of purely Western elements, but steady infusions of Eastern elements. And these infusions come more frequently at certain points in our history and less frequently at others. But the making of Greece can be categorized in a number of ways, but one of them is that Greek civilization is a mix of a heavily masculine culture, what's called the Mycenaean culture, which had its origins probably on the steppes of modern Russia, but somewhere in the Near East, in a landlocked zone. Those blonde, Aryan, horse-riding, sky god-worshipping Mycenaeans, a hyper-masculine culture, infiltrated the peninsula of Greece between the year 2500 BC and the year 900 BC in a series of waves of invasion and infiltration. So you have these strong, virile, horse-riding, landlocked men coming down from the Asian landmass in a series of waves. And they met in the Middle East, or they met in the Mediterranean world, in Greece, an indigenous people, or a probably indigenous people, a people from that zone who were more matriarchal, who were more feminine, who were more balanced in their culture, and who were profoundly seagoing peoples. They're usually called the Minoans, and we associate them with the island of Crete in the Mediterranean. The island of Crete is the southernmost point of Western civilization, at least in the classical world. And so one way of talking about the genius of Greece is that it's a mix of two very different types of people. These masculinized horse people from Russia, these Aryans, and then these more effeminate, more cultured, more seagoing, more truly Mediterranean people who were already living in this zone. Neither one of these cultures could have flourished in the fullest sense on its own. But the mingling of these two cultures produced the miracle of Greece. Somehow the Minoans feminized the Mycenaeans, and the Mycenaeans gave direction and verve and creative energy to the Minoans. And the combination became one of the most extraordinary confluences in human history. To thicken the plot just a little, the Minoans are usually considered either a matriarchal culture, that is a woman-ruled culture, or a matrilineal culture, a culture maybe not woman-ruled, but where power was shared more equally between the sexes, and matrilinear cultures are ones in which power tends to go from woman to daughter, whether they actually wield the authority or not, that the family lines are derived from the woman's side, not the man's. So the Minoan culture is often thought to be, in some regards, a matriarchal culture, and the Mycenaean culture is thoroughly patriarchal. And this actually has significance for what I'm going to say in terms of the law. So that's one way of looking at the legacy of Greece. Another way of looking at it, the genius of Greece, is the Greek power of abstraction. Let me give you two quick examples. The alphabet is often said to be the great founding invention of Western civilization. But as you all know, the alphabet was not invented by the Greeks. The alphabet is a Near Eastern invention, usually ascribed to the Phoenicians. But what the Greeks did with the Phoenician alphabet was extraordinary. I don't want to go into too much detail, but the Phoenician alphabet was what's called a syllabary. In other words, each symbol not only gave us a sound, like ah, ba, ka, but it also symbolized a concept or a thing. So a modern analogy would be Chinese ideographs. So take A, the letter A. We see the letter A as pointing towards the top. In the Phoenician alphabet, the letter A actually pointed towards the side, and it had a snub nose. And Aleph, the Phoenician character Aleph, meant A in the sense that it does for us, but more importantly, it meant cow. It was a visual symbol of a cow. And so you can see the sort of snub-nosed front of a cow's head in the bent-over letter A. What the Greeks did was take this syllabary that existed amongst the Phoenicians, and they decided completely to ignore the symbolic and the sacred possibilities of it. So the A no longer had anything to do with cows. It merely meant A. They abstracted it from its tradition and its significance in a broader and more sacred sense, and they merely made it a convention, a stylized piece of the pen, stroke of the pen that meant the sound A. They did that for the entire alphabet. And so they secularized the alphabet that they were taking from the Phoenicians. They abstracted it and made it purely conventional, and in doing so, they got rid of an incredible amount of cultural baggage that didn't matter to them. At the same time, they liberated an incredible amount of energy because they turned this sort of lubberly system into a system of pure convention. That's part of what made the Greeks the Greeks. They rationalized, they abstracted. Another example, perhaps a little bit less interesting, is their pottery. The pottery that they developed, the famous pottery that we see in books and in museums, began as geometric pottery. The figures, the characters, like Achilles and Odysseus, came later. Early on in the 9th and 10th centuries, Greek pottery was purely geometric. It was geometric patterns, triangles and circles and squares and swastikas, versions of the swastika. And they had taken this over from the Near East also, and in the Near East, each of those configurations had symbolic and sacred value. The Greeks didn't care about that. They just thought, that's an interesting picture, that's an interesting design, that's a pretty motif. And so they took the motifs, but they abandoned the symbolism, the traditional base for them. And again, that enabled the takeoff of Greek plastic art. And of course, we associate the Greeks most thoroughly with science and abstraction, the ability to ratiocinate, to use pure reason. And that again is an abstraction from a thicker, more symbolic, more sacred world. So that's another way of looking at this. But when you step back and try to say, well, you know, most Americans don't read Homer, most Americans don't read Plutarch, most Americans don't read Sophocles or Aeschylus or Euripides, most Americans haven't read a Platonic dialogue. What then is the legacy of ancient Greece? The answer, I think, is that the Greeks, even if we're no longer quite wired to the Greeks, we're still enormously dependent upon them. You've all heard the linguistic discussion of vocabulary, that, for example, among certain Eskimos, there are 39 terms for snow. I come from North Dakota. We have 2 or 3 terms for snow. In Southern California, there are no terms for snow, just snow. You know, that you only have terms, you only have subtle differentiations of terms if it matters. So in California, snow is snow, but except in ski country. And in North Dakota, there are 3 or 4 types of snow, but if you're on the Arctic Circle, snow is your world, and different types of snow have different implications for your daily lives, so there are more terms. Similarly, in the Arctic, I've just been reading a great book called Arctic Dreams by Barry Lopez. There are a whole range of terms for ice. Well, that wouldn't matter in Costa Rica. So different peoples configure their reality differently according to their needs, and their vocabularies spin out different terms to meet this. This is what might be called the matrix of your reality. In other words, if reality is a kind of seemingly formless thing, and then we take concepts and language and begin to divide it up into manageable grids. Well, the Greeks really gave us the grid of Western civilization. Think of our terms. Our basic genres in a college are from the Greeks: history, philosophy, literature, theology. Those are terms from Greek culture, they're from Greek language, and they're also Greek ways of carving up the spectrum of the mind. Philosophy means love of wisdom, etc. Take literature for a moment. Our basic categories of literature, even in the late 20th century, come straight from the Greek world. Drama is a Greek invention, and drama is tragedy and comedy. We have epic. The United States no longer produces epic. Once in a while you see a giant novel or a television program that says epic in proportions. But the epic is a Greek invention. Lyric is a Greek invention, the elegy, the ode. So the basic forms of genre that we talk about in literature come from the Greek achievement. The Greeks created these subcategories of literature, and more or less we continue them to this day. The only major form of literature that the Greeks did not invent is the novel. and you can even make the case that there are proto-novels in the Greek world. So our literary categories come from Greece. Our philosophical categories come from Greece. Our historical categories come from Greece. Or to put it in more practical terms, look at Plutarch. Plutarch was a Greek prose writer who wrote one of the most important books of antiquity, the lives of the eminent Grecians and Romans. He wrote parallel lives, one Greek character paralleled with one Roman character, trying to show that the Roman world was in some regards a recapitulation of the Greek world. And Plutarch's work has been almost as influential as anything that was ever written in the ancient world. The Renaissance was heavily tied to Plutarch. Shakespeare depended upon Plutarch almost more than any single source for his great plays. Coriolanus comes straight out of Plutarch. Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra, you'll meet some of those characters today. Our understanding of them, the way we see them, even in the late 20th century, comes more from Plutarch and Shakespeare than it comes from actual biography, actual history. Timon of Athens comes from Plutarch. Plutarch had a huge influence on Montaigne, the first essayist, and he had an even greater influence on Rousseau. And Will and Ariel Durant, in their massive epic study of Western civilization, say that Rousseau is the man of the millennium. So here's a pivotal figure in the modern world who was self-consciously working in the tradition of Plutarch. Or the American founding fathers, George Washington. Couldn't read Plutarch in the original Greek, of course, but he knew Plutarch very well, and he modeled himself on characters out of Plutarch's lives, chiefly a character named Cincinnatus. And Jefferson, our greatest Greek scholar in American history, knew Plutarch backwards and forwards. So this is another way in which we're the recipient of the Greek legacy. Or, quickly, architecture. If you go to the state capitol in almost any state in America, the capitol is designed as a neoclassical revival, and that harkens back to the Renaissance, and from there to the Roman Republican Empire, and from there to Athens of the 4th century. But virtually every monumental public building created in the 19th century in America was in some regards an echo of Greek architectural designs, Greek motifs. I understand that here in Coeur d'Alene you have a Masonic temple which has neoclassical motifs on it. Whenever someone wants to build an impressive, a pompous building in the United States, even today, there's an almost automatic tendency to pick up Greek and Roman elements, etc., 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 the plastic arts, sculpture. The only one of the plastic arts that we do not know much about from Greece is painting, because painting is, unfortunately, paintings are produced on a very ephemeral medium. Canvases disappear, wooden paper and pieces of wood on which paintings are made tend not to survive very well. So sculpture has much greater life than painting. We don't really know much about Greek painting, but we know a little bit about it via Roman mosaics and so on. So the point I'm making is that whether we know it or not, we are profoundly influenced by the Greek achievement. And the one that I want to focus on for just a short time now is the law. One advantage of studying the ancient world is that it allows us to go back to beginnings, to see the emergence of these traditions. We see in Homer the emergence of Western literature. We see in the pre-Socratics and in the Pythagoreans and even in Plato the emergence of Western philosophy. We see in the Parthenon the emergence of Western architecture. So studying these cultures allows us to get back to the moment when these forms were being produced and to ask questions about the manner in which they were produced and the purposes for which they were produced. We're lucky here in a state like Idaho because just 150 years ago, white Europeans were recreating civilization in the wilderness, or at least they thought so. And so you see many of the same activities recapitulated in the American West. The difference, of course, is that when you create a mining camp or a Masonic lodge or a city council somewhere in frontier Idaho, you're not working in a vacuum. You have 3,000 years of Western civilization to work from. But when you are creating the law courts of ancient Greece, you're essentially working from a vacuum. And so there's a difference. The pioneers of Idaho brought with them an enormous amount of cultural tradition that we can't count on in the ancient world. And look at justice. How did the justice system begin? I don't know if you've ever asked yourself this, but I first asked myself about justice growing up in western North Dakota in Dickinson, and Dickinson is a very peaceful place. But when I was in college, there was a murder. A rancher was murdered, and everyone knew who it was, who did it. And he was apprehended and tried, and eventually he was convicted, but he was not sentenced to death. He was sentenced to a fairly long prison term, and I was actually in the courthouse the day this culprit was sentenced. The man who had been killed had been a beloved figure in western North Dakota. And when the sentence was read out, a fairly mild sentence for such a heinous crime, the family of the victim and friends of the family of the victim expressed outrage. They screamed and wailed and expressed in the most visceral, emotional terms their outrage that this man had received such a light sentence for such a vicious crime. And my father and I were witnessing this, and we began to talk about why these people were so upset. After all, there is a process of justice. The man was arrested, the man was arraigned, the man was represented by an attorney, the man was tried, the man was convicted, and the man was sentenced. There's a very smooth, machine-like process that worked. A crime was committed, the person was convicted, but it didn't satisfy the people who wanted satisfaction. And so what we came to, this is what led to this study of the rise of law in the ancient world, what we came to is the notion that a process of justice is not quite the same as justice, that somehow justice has to do with satisfaction, and the process sometimes shows satisfaction and sometimes doesn't. Let me give you a very quick example more recently, the O.J. Simpson trial. O.J. Simpson is acquitted. I'm just going to assume for a moment that he was guilty. We may disagree, but just bear with me for the moment. I'm going to assume that he committed this crime. He's acquitted in the criminal justice system, and that led to a huge disappointment on the part of the victim's family and friends. But then he was found liable in the civil system and was forced to pay $35 million or so to the victims. And so you got a first round of justice which, in a sense, miscarried, but a second round in which there was some sort of retribution. There was some loss that O.J. Simpson had to sustain. I believe that if there hadn't been the second civil trial, that we would still be talking about this. And indeed, we would be hearing from Ron Brown's father, and we would be hearing more from the victim's family. But in some minimalist sense, the victim's family was satisfied when somehow he had to pay. And he paid, of course, in the American way, with cash. But he had to pay, and if he hadn't paid somehow, this would have never been resolved. Well, this actually sets up nicely the beginnings of justice in the ancient world. In the beginning, the whole world was a kind of jungle. If I murdered your brother, there was no system to take care of this. If I murdered your brother, your only option was to murder me back. But you couldn't go to an authority. There was no formal judicial system. And so this created the first step in the road to the legal system, which is lex talionis, the law of the claw, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, a vendetta code. I kill you, your brother kills me, my uncle kills you, your cousin then kills me, and it's the Hatfields and McCoys forever. There's no end to it. And it takes over. And that's the problem with the vendetta code. The vendetta code has no ending because you may think that if I kill your brother and then you kill me, that settles it. But that doesn't settle it because then my relatives have to get retribution for your killing me. So the code cannot end. And the only way the vendetta code ever ends is if the families snuff each other out or if they just get so exhausted that they separate. But then this can flare up again, as you know. So the vendetta code is a highly imprecise and extremely violent form of justice. But it's the world before law. So the decisive moment in the history of civilization, in my view, is when we find some mechanism which allows us to prevent the vendetta code from going on endlessly. And the Greeks actually did this. Other cultures have done it too, but the Greeks did it in a very extraordinary way. The first step beyond the vendetta code is to find some recompense, some price. And so let's say that I kill your brother, and your natural reaction is to want to kill me. But instead, representatives of my family come to your house and say, he did it, he shouldn't have done it, we're terribly sorry for this, but we've brought you gifts. We've brought you 10 cows and 5 horses and 3 chariots and a tripod. And you say, that's not enough, that's not good enough. How can I ever accept mere stuff for a life? And so we say, well, we'll double it. We'll give you 30 cows and 50 horses. Eventually, even though you're not satisfied in the fullest sense of the term, you reluctantly agree to take the gifts. And in some regards, that settles it. That's the first step, and it actually is encoded in the Iliad. If you read Homer's Iliad, which is not about justice per se, it's not a sociological tract, you can find that level of civilization where a private arrangement of gifts of recompense is worked out. This is called composition formally. Well, that's a private matter, and it's not always satisfying. It can flare up at any time. The next step, step 2 in the road to civilization, is in many regards the most important one. And that's, instead of my family going to your house with the gifts, we go instead into the public square where people are gathered. And there my family makes a kind of public speech and says what he did was wrong, he's bringing these gifts. He knows that's inadequate, but this is all he can do. And then your family complains that gifts will never be satisfying and so on. And this goes back and forth, and there's even some sort of rhetorical posturing in all of this. Maybe the details have already been worked out behind the scenes. But what's important about it when it's in the public arena is 2 things. First of all, the public, in some regards, can referee. The public creates a kind of forum which decides whether justice has been done. And the public then is learning about justice, the process of justice, by seeing instances, by seeing cases. Just as we thought when the O.J. Simpson trial began that we would all learn something about the American criminal justice system, it turns out we didn't. It was a travesty. The idea of public justice is, in some regards, a civics lesson, or at least is intended to be. So when you get the public involved, you've made an important next step. The third step is when you name an arbiter. When I bring the gifts, your family rejects the gifts, and the arbiter says 50 cows but not 80 cows, 20 horses but not 50 horses. The arbiter starts to select these solutions, and we all more or less grudgingly agree to them. So that was really the world as you see it emerging in the Iliad. And I want to give you an example of it from Homer's Iliad. In Book 18, Achilles needs new armor, and Hephaestus, the god of the smith god, produces him a shield, the shield of Achilles. This is one of the celebrated passages in Homer. The shield is the shield that Achilles is going to carry into war, and on it are chiseled in metal all of the most important things that happen in a civilization. So you have the heavens and the sun and the moon and the ocean and so on. You get a kind of cosmology at the rim of the shield. And then in the center of the shield there are different scenes, scenes of peace, scenes of war, a wedding scene, a scene in which shepherds are attacked by a lion and so on. You get a kind of encapsulation of the main structures of the Homeric world chiseled on the front of the shield. And one of the most important scenes is a scene of justice. You can see the Greeks struggling to create a process of justice in this passage. I'll just read you the part on the trial. Homer's describing the plastic art, what's visually on the front of this shield. The people were assembled in the marketplace, where a quarrel had arisen, and 2 men were disputing over the blood price for a man who had been killed. So here they're trying to decide how much merchandise is recompense. One man promised full restitution in a public statement, but the other refused and would accept nothing. Both then made for an arbitrator to have a decision, and people were speaking up on either side to help both men. But the heralds kept the people in hand, as meanwhile the elders were in session on benches of polished stone in the sacred circle, and held in their hands the staves of the heralds who lift their voices. The two men rushed before these and took turns speaking their cases, and between them lay on the ground 2 talents of gold, 2 bricks of gold, to be given to that judge who in this case spoke the straightest opinion. So here you see the dispute, the attempt to decide what is the proper price. In this case it's gold. The gifts. You see the people gathered. There's an informal attorney system where people come up and help make the case for each side. You have judges sitting on a special dais looking at this. And then the people, apparently, the citizens at large, are going to decide which judge gives the ablest decision and award him gold at the end. Well, here we have some of the elements of the modern judicial system being created around the 9th century BC in Greece. Well, the next step, and really an incredible moment in the history of civilization, is described in the Oresteia, in this 3-part tragedy by Aeschylus. Let me quickly explain the plot of the Oresteia. In the Oresteia, in play number 1 of the 3, the Agamemnon, the great war leader of the Greeks, comes back after 10 years at Troy. He's the hero of the Trojan War. He comes back to his home in Mycenae, in mainland Greece. He gets home, his wife rolls out a red carpet for him and welcomes him home in triumph, and then she says, I think you should probably take a ceremonial purification bath, and then we'll have a feast, and then we'll make love. And while he's bathing, she and her adulterous lover, Aegisthus, murder Agamemnon in the bath. Now she, Clytemnestra, and he, Aegisthus, the lovers, the adulterous lovers, each have reasons to kill Agamemnon. I won't go into this, but they have ancient quarrels, ancient enmity towards Agamemnon that gets worked out in this bloodletting in the bathtub. The house of Atreus, the house of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra and Menelaus and Helen, that house is one of the most dysfunctional families of the ancient world. And there's bad blood in every direction. But for this discussion, the point is that Agamemnon comes home in triumph, and on the day of his homecoming, he's slaughtered in his own house, in his bathtub, by his own wife and her lover. Well, now, according to the Lex Talionis, the blood code, somebody has to get revenge on these 2 evil beings. And who is to do it? Well, according to the blood code, the person closest to Agamemnon has to avenge him, and that is his son Orestes. So Orestes comes out of exile, and now he has the very difficult duty of killing Aegisthus, and he doesn't like him at all. This doesn't cost him much conscience. After all, he is his mother's adulterous lover. But he also, according to the blood code, has to kill his own mother. He does not want to do this, of course. And he wouldn't do it unless he were forced to do it by the vendetta code. And there are something in the ancient world called the Furies, these bloody, old goddess women figures who drive you insane unless you fulfill the blood code. And so he has no choice. He's driven literally insane while he tries to avoid doing this duty. And eventually he has no choice, and he kills Aegisthus, and he kills his mother. Well, now he's completely insane because he's so horrified by what he has done. And it looks like this is going to go on forever. Now Aegisthus's children will try to kill him, and we'll have this sort of world without end vendetta cycle. Finally, Athena and Apollo step in. Athena is the goddess of wisdom. Apollo is the god of reason. And they step in and they say, enough is enough. We're not going to let these hag-like blood goddesses, these Furies, force people to do these abysmal crimes any longer. We're actually going to create a court, the Areopagus, in Athens, where these things get tried. And they're going to be tried by process and abstraction. And so, at the end of the Oresteia, in a play called The Libation Bearers, Athena and Apollo force an ending to the vendetta cycle and create the first legitimate process judicial system of the ancient world, the Greek law system in Athens. But here's the genius of it. Obviously, when you create this process, the problem of vengeance doesn't go away. People still want vengeance. Ron Brown's father wants vengeance. The people whose children were killed yesterday in Arkansas will want vengeance. It's a natural human reaction. The survivors of the Oklahoma City bombing want vengeance. So this human urge to vengeance, this fury, doesn't go away just because we create a formal process. So how do you provide some satisfaction at the same time you find a mechanism that allows civilization to go on without too much internal mayhem? That's the great paradox of justice. A process that allows civilization to bind its wounds and carry on, at the same time that it doesn't forget that humans are emotional creatures who have this bloodlust to get revenge. Well, here's what Athena does. She takes these furies, these hag-like goddesses who demand justice, and she says, I'm not going to banish you entirely. You're going to have an honorary place in the court system of Athens. You're going to be called the libation bearers, the peaceful, the kindly ones. And you're going to watch each of these cases as it comes through. And you're going to keep saying, we need satisfaction. There has to be satisfaction. And if you see that the process becomes too abstract, that justice isn't being done, that the malefactors are going free, and that the victims are not feeling that their needs were being taken care of, then you have a chance to speak out as a kind of higher court of appeals. So the Furies, in a sense, are kicked upstairs to an honorific position, but with genuine supervisory functions. You see what an ingenious solution this is, that instead of the abstraction that we might think of as just get rid of the Furies, get rid of vengeance altogether. But the Greeks were too intelligent for this. They knew that we have this dark, bloody side to us, and we shouldn't pretend otherwise. So they gave the Furies an honorary position in the courts, but one of very limited power and more supervisory and more spiritual than actual in the process. Well, this is all encoded in this very beautiful trilogy, the Oresteia. We actually are watching the emergence of a justice system that works going on in the ancient world. And again, it's that same abstraction system that we saw in the alphabet and in the Greek vases at work here. And from there, the number of variations between the Areopagus, which was created probably in the 5th or 6th century BC in Athens, and the jury in the O.J. Simpson trial, the amount of difference in that is very slight, really. Once that breakthrough happens, the rest is really details, which I think is amazing. So let me summarize it this way by saying in the beginning, the justice system was all Jerry Springer. Person A sleeps with person B. Person B's brother comes in and beats the stuffing out of person A. Then they all have a melee, and finally Jerry has his moment where he decries violence. It all looked like that for centuries, for millennia. That's the way the world worked. And then after an infinite amount of thinking and struggle, the Greeks invented Ricky Lake, where you get to kind of scream and rage and say rotten things that get beeped out, but you're not slugging each other quite so often. Occasionally you slug, but more often you just shout. And then after another millennium of agonizing work, you get to Jenny Jones. And then you all aspire to Oprah, somewhere far, far down the chain of civilization. That's how it works, that in the beginning everything is Jerry Springer, and in the end we hope it's Oprah, but actually we keep falling back all the time into these more primitive phases. I mean, ask yourself why the American people are watching the Jerry Springer show. It's because, for one thing, it's circus. But for another thing, it allows us to watch justice getting worked out in the way that we all secretly would like to work it out. I mean, how many times have you wanted to take a baseball bat to somebody and you can't? And there you get to see people doing it on a regular basis. The Greeks understood this, that just because you can create a Supreme Court and a Constitution and a Bill of Rights and a Magna Carta, the human urge to being bestial does not go away. That has to have expression. And if you banish the Furies from your culture, you have miscarried the whole notion of honest human psychology. So you have to incorporate that without letting it take over. Think how delicate that is. I want to close. We have about 8 minutes. I want to close with one other thing. Two other things, actually. I mentioned several books, the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Aeneid, the Oresteia. I hope you'll read them. Another book that I highly recommend, and a very short book, one of the greatest books in our tradition, is Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents. Now, I know Freud's reputation is in some disarray at the moment, but Freud is one of the greatest humanists of the modern world, and my favorite of his books is Civilization and Its Discontents. It's a pamphlet about 70 pages, and it's all about this issue of the reptilian brain and the Apollonian brain trying to live in the same world. And he says this in Civilization and Its Discontents, and he's really, in a sense, talking about what I've been talking about, the Oresteia moment. This replacement of the power of the individual in justice by the power of the community constitutes the decisive step in civilization. Once again, this replacement of the power of the individual by the power of a community constitutes the decisive step in civilization. But what the Greeks remind us is that you cannot eliminate the urge for blood satisfaction altogether, and if you do, there will be no community that can cohere. And then the last thing I want to say is I read something in Rousseau in preparing for this lecture that I thought was very interesting, if I can find it. Yes. And this is, I don't want to get political, but think of our current president as you think of this passage. Rousseau is talking about leaders and law. And one of the points that I'm making this morning is that civilization is extremely fragile, that human passions and human bloodlusts and human anarchist tendencies and human bestiality are just below the surface. And civilization is a very, very fragile veneer of good behavior and process that we have developed. And it isn't something that just was invented. It's something that has to be worked out in agonizing fashion over thousands of years by the best people of every culture. And even then, it descends into mayhem more often than we like, as we saw yesterday in Arkansas. So how do you hold this all together? Well, Rousseau in The Social Contract says this: the leader, he says, the legislator, as he calls him with a capital L, must be a man of superior intelligence who can understand the passions of other men without feeling them, who has no affinity with our nature but knows it to the fullest, whose happiness is independent of ours but who can nevertheless make our happiness his concern, who would be content to wait in the fullness of time for a distant glory and to labor in one age to enjoy the fruits of another. What's his point? That the leader of a successful civilization must be a man of exemplary character, because this whole thing depends in some sense upon our daily willingness to rise above our bestiality and do the right thing. Let me say the first sentence again. The leader must be a man of superior intelligence who can understand the passions of men without feeling them, who has no affinity with our nature but knows it to the full. Well, the most deplorable thing that can be said of our current president is that he understands the passions of men, and then he rubs our nose in it. And he understands human nature, but he can't even rise above the worst human nature. And I don't mean this particularly of him. He's not alone in this. But Rousseau is saying this thing only works under certain very, very limited and delicate conditions, and the leader has an enormous responsibility to lift the civilization. If Rousseau is right, and the allegations are correct, then we are in a very, very deplorable state and on our way back to lex talionis. Thank you. Tony is the autocrat. Do we have time for one question? One question. Yes, over here. I can't say whether, the question is, did any ancient civilizations abolish or attempt to abolish the death penalty? I don't know enough about the history of comparative law to answer this. I'm profoundly Eurocentric. I don't know what was happening in Indonesia or Japan or the Philippines or Hawaii. So when I say ancient civilization, I'm locked into a kind of Eurocentric view of Greece and Rome. No, they did not. The Greeks had an ingenious system, though. The Greeks could be completely civilized and completely violent on the same day. So if you were convicted of an aggravated murder in ancient Greece, you were taken up to the hill, to the top of the Areopagus, and thrown off. And you died when you hit the rocks, and that was it. There was no delay in justice. There were no appeals. There was no endless system. It was just taken care of. Swift, certain justice. No ancient culture avoided this. Draco, from which we get the term draconian in law. Draco, I think, had 250 different crimes that could lead to the death penalty. And it was a capital crime to steal a cabbage. It was also a capital crime to murder 14 people in Arkansas. And when Draco was said, isn't this a paradox, that if you can have the death penalty for stealing a cabbage, then why only a death penalty for murdering a bunch of people? Draco said, well, the person who steals the cabbage deserves death, and that's the highest penalty. And if we could figure out some other way to punish the more heinous criminal more, we would, but that's it. So it's, in other words, instead of liberalizing the bottom end of the code, Draco said, it doesn't take much for you to destroy your social contract, your right to exist as a free person. We've obviously come a long way from that, but in my understanding, no Western civilization of the ancient world ever even toyed with abolishing the death penalty. The death penalty is part of that satisfaction that people demand. The only problem with our culture is that we still demand it. The American people decidedly want the death penalty. You can debate that endlessly in ethical terms, but they want the death penalty. But then if you wait 35 years from the moment that the death penalty is imposed to the time that it is finally carried out, a number of problems occur. Two chiefly. I'll quickly close with this. One problem is that the satisfaction is gone because most of the people have given up. They don't even care about it anymore by the time the execution finally occurs. The satisfaction needs to occur early while the emotional heat is still on. And so that's one problem. The second problem is, as you saw with the woman in Texas, these people, if you leave them for 30 years, they often have conversion experiences and become nice people. And then, what do? Now you have to kill a nice person who's actually been rehabilitated in some sense. So if you're going to have a death penalty, what Western civilization teaches us is do it while people are still angry and do it before the victim has a chance to repent, because otherwise, terrible, I don't mean to sound frivolous in this, but people want satisfaction, and if that's part of your code, if that's what you have to have, you'd better do it swiftly, because otherwise huge ethical problems start to creep in. Anyway, Tony's giving me that look, so I won't carry on, but thanks so much. We'll have a time to talk.